What's up, church family? Welcome back to the Revivalist for Christ channel. I'm your host, Jordan, and we have another great guest today. We have Christian author Mark Ward. Mark, welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me, Jordan.
Absolutely. I'm so excited for today's conversation. But guys, if you can let us know that you can see and hear us all right by putting Mark's favorite emoji, the thumbs up emoji, in the chat, that would be great. But Mark, before we hop into the conversation, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, your testimony, and your calling into ministry?
Yeah, I am a Christian husband to Laura, who is the proprietress of Blackburn Gardens, a micro-urban flower farm in our backyard here in the beautiful Skagit Valley of Washington. I work full-time for Faith Life, makers of Logos Bible software. I am the editor of Bible Study Magazine and a senior editor for digital content for the Word by Word blog, which you can find at logos.com/grow or logos.com/grow. It's sometimes pronounced that way, and that's totally fine. I was raised in a Christian home, and I don't ever remember not believing in Jesus, but I had a profession of faith, experience at age 4, and then it's hard for me to say, when was I saved? I don't know. I trust in Christ, and He's my only hope for salvation. I'm privileged to give that testimony for sure. And I went to Christian college and was studying to be a graphic design major, but I wound up in a church which had the best expository preaching I had ever heard and still have. That pastor who became a mentor to me was incredibly skilled with the scriptures and a humble and gracious man who I just wanted to be like. And without even really thinking about it like this, I now realize I ended up following his path. I changed my major to Bible after a particularly stirring sermon from Ephesians 3 about Paul's obligations to the Gentiles given the revelation he'd received. And I felt I, too, had been given so much in the way of good Bible teaching. And I didn't know this. I thought I was being called to some kind of teaching/preaching ministry. And that wasn't totally off. I thought I'd probably be a missionary to a Spanish-speaking country. But I ended up working as a Bible textbook author for 9 years for BJU Press, and then coming out here to Washington now 7 years ago to do various things for Faith Life, all centering around basically Logos Bible software and Lexham Press. I have a terminal degree from BJU Seminary in New Testament, and I've been able to use my Greek and Hebrew knowledge and theology knowledge, such as it is, to serve Christ Church up here. I also am very dedicated to the local church, and I was an assistant pastor for a number of years. It's hard to explain, but informally and then formally at a little church plant that ultimately voted to close exactly 1 year ago yesterday. And now my wife and I and our 3 kids, we attend church in our town and are really enjoying kind of plugging in there, serving in various ways. I think I gave all the stuff that you asked for. Is that about right?
Yeah, I love it. I actually had no idea that you were connected to Logos Bible software, and it is my goal one day to be able to afford the higher packages, but I have the free package right now because free is always in the budget.
And make sure to get on the free book of the month email, because not only, and you didn't bring me on here to advertise for Logos, but I actually love it and care about it. I use it all the time myself. Yeah, I always tell people just at least get the free book every month because it is often very good. I don't pick them, but I remember when they first started doing this, and I was like, they're not picking cheapo stuff that's not worth having. They're picking good stuff. And then often, always in that email, they'll also be like a $2 book and a $4 book and a $6 book. And often those are also worth having and a great discount. So everybody at least get the free version of Logos and go get on the free book of the month email list.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great software. I'm somebody who loves to read, which brings us to your book that you're here to talk about today. So, Mark, you are actually the author of the book, Authorized, the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what your journey was like writing that book? What was your initial calling to write this book, and a little bit what it's about?
Yeah, I spent 4 years in high school in a King James only church and their Christian school. And I always say, because it's true, that I had a great experience. My teachers loved me. They were faithful. They taught me to read the Bible, and they weren't hypocrites. I'm still friends with especially some of the younger teachers there. Some of the older ones have actually passed away. One of my favorite teachers, my art teacher, died a few years ago. And yet, over time, I came to see that King James onlyism as a doctrine was not taught in Scripture, and that the folks who advance this doctrine and believe it are cutting themselves off from the value, excuse me, getting over the flu, the value of using multiple English Bible translations. I don't know if it's, yes, it is. It's up on my shelf now. I might as well get it, and then you'll see the light behind me.
Yeah, absolutely. And while he's grabbing that, guys, if you could keep Mark in your prayer, as he just said, he is overcoming the flu at the moment, but he was gracious enough to still come on. So just keep him in prayer throughout this stream, please. And
Thank you. Yeah, I am feeling better, but I tend to, last couple of days, get worse as the day progresses. Right here, it's still morning time on the West Coast, so I'm feeling pretty good. But this is my comparative study Bible, and I got it in July of 1999. I actually really specifically recall going to the Crossway Christian Supply across the street from where I was in college. It had to be across the street because I didn't have a car, and buying this for $50, which at that time, I don't even know where I had $50. That's like $100 today. And, to me then it was like 1,000 because I did not make money. And the Lord provided for me. I was actually going to school tuition free because my dad worked for the school, taught for them. But this was a major outlay, and I loved it. I read the King James column, which I'd grown up with. I read the Amplified column and never did really get into that. But the New American Standard and the NIV, they really, really helped. And after years and years of reading this, and here's my notes in the little margins. Thankfully, the Amplified means that there's a lot of empty space on each page because it's so long. I just was inoculated against any form of this version onlyism because I saw, and soon saw with greater clarity after taking Greek and then later Hebrew, I just saw it's really valuable to have slightly different perspectives on the meaning of a given text, whether the English translation that you read is dynamic or literal, functional or formal, it's called. That brings a value. Also, even if that's not even in play, there are times when God has inspired some ambiguity. Think especially of the Proverbs. I remember really reading the Proverbs and thinking, wow, I just didn't get it before. And now that I read the NIV, I get it. And even in my, very conservative circles that were not King James only, like my pastor was a leader against King James onlyism in college. There was still this nervousness about the NIV. There still kind of is. And I realized, no, I'm not going to turn down anything that helps me understand better what God says. So all of those experiences, first being in King James onlyism, then coming out of it very smoothly. It wasn't this, a very difficult time for me, a transition. I don't even remember my mind changing. I just know that it did. And then having a real interest in Bible translation and seeing the value of the multiple translations, I started to realize a little bit more work needs to be done to graciously invite King James onlyists into the embarrassment of riches that we have in English Bible translation.
Yeah, and I remember you were talking about how in your book, this was actually probably the best investment for you, theologically speaking. And I actually myself, it's so ironic that I was reading this because I myself have been considering buying a comparative Bible or a parallel Bible because I have had a great and increasing interest in the NASB. And I believe it was those same four versions, the Amplified, NIV, NASB, and KJV. And so kind of hearing your experience has only kind of convinced me more so to purchase it. But yeah, that's awesome. Now, I did have quotes pulled up here, Mark, and you saw them ahead of time,
I
but
did. I believe
now
you.
that we're live, it's gonna act up. So I apologize for that, but we will go ahead and still read some of these quotes because I really enjoyed a lot of your quotes in this in the book, and I wanted to have a visual for people, but one of the quotes very early on that I noted is when you said objections to the readability of the KJV are not beside the point, they are the point.
Yeah, actually, you say that, and this very day, let me see if I can find it again. Yeah, I got a comment on a video I did just recently on my YouTube channel, which was, can I trust the CSB, MEV, and NLT, 3 different contemporary English Bible translations? It was a very brief video, and as is my custom, I didn't talk about textual criticism, which is the common leading objection to the modern versions from our King James only brothers. They're insistent we've got to use the same Greek and Hebrew texts that were used by the King James translators. I got this comment that said, manuscript used is the issue. And I insist that it's not, because in fact, I can just read to you my response. I have a canned response. If I type NKJVA on any of my iOS devices, it spits out, my friend, the New King James Version and the Modern English Version both use the same underlying Hebrew and Greek text as the King James, and they translate those texts into fully intelligible contemporary English, which means they meet the principle of 1 Corinthians 14, edification requires intelligibility. I recommend the New King James and Modern English Version to you. Yeah, that's what I say. If the text really were the issue, then we would expect some level of, varied practice among people who prefer the Greek text underlying the King James. Some of them might use the New King James or Modern English Version or any of a number of other versions that are based on the same Hebrew and Greek texts, rather than the mildly different ones that are used by contemporary versions. They're not significantly different in my estimation. But I can see why some people would prefer to stick with what the church has used for a good while. And but the fact is that a vanishingly small percentage of people who say they prefer those same Hebrew and Greek texts use anything other than the King James. And the Bible doesn't speak clearly to how we do textual criticism, how we reconcile the various minor differences among the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts that have come down to us over time. But it does say very clearly, edification requires intelligibility. And my complaint about the King James has nothing to do with its quality. It's an excellent translation. My complaint is not about the translation, but about its current use. It wasn't designed to be used by people 4 centuries later. It was designed to be used by people for the time period in which it was translated. And language change over time has made it so that the issue is readability, not textual criticism.
Yeah. Well, and just so you know how I kind of ran into this conversation myself, Mark, it was when I first got on YouTube. I've never heard of the KJV only movement prior to getting on YouTube. And so I come from a Wesleyan tradition, and I since have left that, and I became Reformed for quite some time, but I've left that as well, and I'm kind of just on my own personal theological journey trying to escape traditions, which we're actually going to talk about today. But for me, one of the things that I had become a strong advocate for, and I continue to try to bring delight on my channel, is the Septuagint. And I noticed that as soon as I started talking about the Septuagint, there was this huge rise of KJV only activists coming, and they were kind of attacking. And I was like, okay, so I think it's at least worth having this conversation. And what I value about your book is I feel it is a great middle ground, because you're somebody who cherishes the KJV, somebody who defends the KJV, but at the same time, you allow for other translations. And I really do think that's a healthy place to be.
Right. Yeah. I did a video for Credo House, one of my most popular videos on, boy, what was the title? Something about how to rescue people from the trap of King James onlyism. And that's a little more clickbaity than maybe I typically do. And so I've had a lot of views on there. A lot of people who were, I think, skeptical of my viewpoint start there. And one of the things I say in that video is that King James onlyists do have a reputation for being jerks online. And I don't like saying that. I work hard to be charitable and gracious, in large part, well, because the Bible tells me to. You know, the Bible tells me that gentleness is one of the fruit of the Spirit. But I felt that it was important in this case to acknowledge the simple fact that ought to be observable even by my brothers and sisters in King James onlyism, that there's a lot of sin that goes on in their speech, and they do attack. And the reason they're attacking you on the Septuagint is they have this intuitive feel, whether they articulate it or not. And you know, some of them do. And I get this. I understand this. They think that there has to be one perfect standard of doctrine. And I would say the same thing. You know, I believe in an inerrant Bible, but they push the inerrancy onto the translation of the Bible. And then subtly, sometimes they push it into the interpretation of the Bible. It's rare that you'll hear them acknowledge that there's any passage that could be ambiguous at all, even in stuff that isn't doctrinal. You know, the Proverbs are sometimes famously difficult. A man that hath friends must show himself friendly. Well, the contemporary versions say a man of many friends will come to ruin. Like, they have to have one, and the Septuagint just does not match, you know, the Hebrew Bible, let alone the English translation of it that our King James only brothers prefer. But I value the Septuagint. I worked on the Lexham English Septuagint for Lexham Press. I wish I could have done even more on it. It was really fun to work on that. It was really enriching. And what I saw repeatedly, and I had William. Oh, come on! His name is now escaping me. A guy who's a major name in evangelical Septuagint studies. He's a younger guy. I can't believe his name escaped me. It's going to come back. He wrote a book on the Septuagint, and I had him write an article for Bible Study Magazine in which he showed that the Septuagint uses the very same kinds of translation strategies that are still in use today, basically the formal to functional spectrum. And they face the same difficulties. You know, how do you translate idioms? So instead of seeing the Septuagint as a threat to the one translation that must rule them all, I see it as a valuable contribution to both translation, in that it's giving us the perspective of ancient Jews before Christ on the meaning of the Hebrew Bible. And boy, how valuable is that? And then also it actually has a value for textual criticism, because there are some places in the Hebrew Bible where the wording is so incredibly difficult that you're just reaching for help. And the Septuagint is a great help there. So I don't see the Septuagint as an enemy, but as a friend, even though I'm a Protestant and it's the Greek and the Hebrew that retain primacy for me.
Yeah. Well, and I could go on for hours about this now that Mark, I wish I had some of these conversations with you beforehand, because now I have so many follow-up questions, but I don't want to divert from the original conversation. So I do have a couple of questions from quotes that you had in the Septuagint later on. So I'm looking forward to getting to that conversation. But guys, first of all, if you are interested in the book, it is in the description, along with all other links from Mark's social media, his websites. And also, guys, one thing that's great about this particular book is that it is on Audible. And if you guys do the Revivalist for Christ, that's the wrong one. if you guys do the Revivalist for Christ Audible trial, you guys can actually receive that book for free. And even if you cancel your 30-day trial, you will still be able to keep the book. So definitely worth checking out if you are interested. And so, Mark, before we continue the conversation, I think it's important to speak to those who may be tuning in from the KJV only camp. Why do you feel this is an important conversation to have, and why should they continue to why should they stay tuned for the rest of this conversation?
I was raised in independent Baptist fundamentalism, and I still uphold all of the key doctrines that I was taught in that world. I think that they were right about so many things. And the biggest thing they were right about that they drummed into me was biblical authority. And I think that where the independent Baptist world of my youth, you know, in my high school years in that King James only church, where they have gone off the rails is in relatively few areas, one of which is the King James only controversy. And the general trend, however, there is they are so intent and in a good way about obeying the Bible that I don't think they see sometimes how they go beyond the Bible in order to supposedly revere the Bible. And, you know, they're known for legalistic standards, which, yes, can become pharisaical. But for me, I'm even positive about that experience because I actually needed to be told, don't watch raunchy television. And it was a good thing for me to be in a place that valued personal holiness. And I don't think was full of hypocrites. There certainly were hypocrites, like there I think will be in any church. But I would encourage my King James only brothers, any of those who are listening or will listen in the future, to do exactly what you taught me to do, and that is to be biblical. And I want you to really ask yourself honestly, does the Bible teach King James onlyism? Even if the Bible teaches that God will preserve his word perfectly, and I don't think it does. Psalm 12, 6 and 7 is not talking about scriptural preservation. And Matthew 5:18, which is where Jesus says, not a jot or a tittle will pass from the law until all is fulfilled. I don't think that he's promising perfect manuscript copies. But even if he were, the Bible does not tell us how to locate this perfect text. And everywhere you look, you're going to find minor variation, even among King James editions. So I would say set that aside. All the textual critical stuff, you know, arguing about manuscripts and printed editions of the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, especially if you can't even read those languages. Why argue about those things? Focus on what the Bible says clearly. Edification requires intelligibility. You're not going to be able to understand God's word fully and help others understand it if you insist on using a translation that's 400 years old and through no fault of its own is no longer fully intelligible. It's stacked up, which something I'm sure we'll talk about, Jordan, these dead words and false friends. Words we know we don't know, besom, chambering, emerald, and words we don't know, like remove and commend and halt. It's really important. If we're going to obey the Bible, we have to understand it, even the little stuff. And I sweat those small details, just like you taught me out there in the King James only world. So I encourage you to do the same. Be biblical. That's my encouragement to our King James only brothers and sisters.
I love that so much. And that is a prominent message throughout your book is no one's to blame here. We don't have to pass fault on anyone. It's not the translator's fault. It's not the reader's fault. There's just a time gap. And I love one of the quotes that you put in here. It says, once mud starts flying, it's difficult for anything edifying to occur. And I agree wholeheartedly. This shouldn't be about bashing somebody's traditions, but it should be about bringing a greater scope. And you talked about the edification that Paul references in 1 Corinthians 14. And Paul's main point in 1 Corinthians 14 is if people can't understand what you're saying, it's useless.
Right. I spent a lot of years in evangelism in the not so nice parts of Greenville, South Carolina. And I was just talking to my best friend yesterday about there's a young man who started in like 3rd grade coming to our weekly teen club ministry. He was allowed to come, I think, even though he was younger because his older brother was there and we had a policy. I think he had to start in like 6th grade or something. But this young man came from all of the stereotypical nasty, wrong side of the tracks circumstances. Didn't have a dad. If I understand correctly, his older brother was into drugs and got in trouble with the law. That would be his double older brother. His middle older brother actually made a profession of faith and may possibly be following the Lord. And this young man is now going into the army and is, by all accounts, following the Lord. That just thrills my heart. I mean, he's just coming out of the worst circumstance, except he had a mom who was really special. That not everybody in that world had such a stable and loving mom, and I believe she was a Christian. Anyway, I really cared about these folks. I spent a lot of time in those neighborhoods and reaching out and trying to invest. And it really, really upset me when I would go with other folks to try to give the gospel, other, people who were raised in the same conservative circles I was. And I'm still a conservative, right? But so conservative, we got to conserve the King James tradition. And they would quote the King James to people who were probably at least a little bit drunk, even at 9 a.m., who probably never made it past 10th grade, if that, who were into all kinds of trouble, who spend all their time watching TV and never read a book. And they're rattling off King James memory verses. And I'm thinking, what is the point? People are not understanding. So when I hear very commonly from King James defenders, oh, Mark Ward is trying to dumb down the Bible. I hear it practically every day. And I think back to 1 Corinthians 14, where one of the people, okay, so the first reason that edification requires intelligibility, the first audience, what's the word I want here? The first value I'm trying to defend is trying to edify other Christians in the body. But 1 Corinthians 14 also talks about the uninitiated, the guy who comes into your church service off the street. And if you're all speaking in tongues and nobody's translating, he's going to think you're crazy. That's what they say. But if you prophesy, in other words, if you use words he can understand, then he will fall down and confess, this is King James language, that God is in you of a truth. We have to have our main eyes on the body of Christ when we're preaching and teaching. I think that's right. The church, the Bible is given to the church, but God's word is also given to the lost. And we have to have an eye toward their understanding. So I refuse to accept the idea that thinking of the non-Christian plowboy when I translate is somehow adulterating God's word. No, I think that's what I'm called to do as a translator, which is a kind of Bible teacher in my estimation.
Yeah, absolutely. And oh gosh, it's so tragic to see, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts eventually as to what I see being a contributing factor to a lot of this. But you actually quote somebody in your book, Glenn Scourgy, and he says, if a translation is published but fails to communicate, is it really a translation? And I actually asked that question to the viewers in a poll prior to this, and 100% of them said no. And
right.
It's like, yeah, exactly. Like, if we're not understanding the words that we're saying, and as you mentioned in your book, just glossing over the words, and you shared probably one of the most, and I don't know, maybe thought-provoking was the better intention of what you were trying to get across. But for me, I was heartbroken when I was reading about your camp story and how you all were meant to, or told to memorize one of the Psalm verses. It escapes me at the
Psalms
moment.
37:8, fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. Yeah.
Can you speak on that experience?
Yeah. Actually, moments before this interview, I was texting with the son of the director of that camp, who's still my friend. He's a pastor in this area. Their family has recently suffered a tragedy. The young husband of one of the daughters of the director died suddenly at age 38. And that family, I won't name them. I mean, anybody who knows my world will know exactly who I'm talking about. They're a very special family. I absolutely love this family. And there were so many godly and wonderful people on the full-time staff at this camp. But, and this is a contrast, I feel that they were held a little bit hostage by their constituency when it came to the King James, and I gathered that may still be the case. So many of the churches that send kids to this camp insist on the exclusive use of the King James and view any deviation from that as the first step on the road to the depths of degradation. As the Music Man said, first it's a little medicinal wine from a teaspoon, then beer from a bottle. Anyway, they had a policy that you had to use the King James Version. And so we were, as counselors, given this list of memory verses. And what does everybody do? You start with the shortest one. You get points if your campers memorize these verses. So amidst all the other things I'm doing as a counselor, I'm helping them do memory verses, which was great. And of course, I memorized the memory verses because I did it for 10 weeks. And the very first one on the list was Psalm 37:8. I still remember it in the King James. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. And that much I get, right? Stop being angry. Get rid of your wrath. Okay. Then it says, fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. And I don't mind saying I have more than one graduate degree. I don't mind saying I've spent a lot more time in the Oxford English Dictionary scurrying around in the history of English than most people. I have listened to every single episode of the History of English podcast. I am a devotee of John McWhorter, who talks a lot about etymology and linguistics of English. I have a lot of interest and care in this topic. I still don't understand what that means. And I have a lot of people telling me, basically, you idiot, it means X. And I'm like, brother, I'm trying to understand still. And your explanation, maybe you're right, but you didn't show me how you got there. I think I get the general gist, and I can read contemporary translations. I can read the Hebrew, but I can't make in any wise connect the two ideas. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. You know, I've written on this and I've worked on it. I think the best possibility is fret not thyself doesn't mean don't worry there. It means don't agitate yourself in any way to do evil. That's the best I can come up with. But I say I'm still not sure I understand it because I'm still not sure that's right. And I don't blame the King James translators. And I don't think I bear blame. I've tried my hardest. I'm filled with the Spirit. I believe I'm illuminated by Him. But the Spirit needs to work through your understanding, or else why have translations? And I just the other day, again, got somebody from the King James only world insisting that I was an absolute dummy because I couldn't understand the obvious meaning of this verse. But I didn't understand, and I don't understand. And I remember asking around, oh my goodness, it just occurred to me. The person I asked was the wife of this pastor friend of mine in this area. She was a counselor too. She wasn't married to him at the time, and we were all the same age. We were like 19. And I said, what do you think this means? She didn't know. I don't remember how many other people I asked, but nobody knew. And I really remember this. People were like surprised to be asked, what does this actually mean? But that has been my MO for I don't know how long. I was a teenager. And I just, even at that time, figured like, why are we bothering to teach people memory verses that they don't and can't understand? That is a violation of all that I'd been taught, really. But that's what tradition does. Now, I uphold the value of tradition. We can talk about this. You mentioned this earlier. You can't be without it. And there are valuable aspects of the great tradition that I hold on to. I think Trinitarian orthodoxy is, utterly crucial. But tradition, as the Protestant reformers showed, can also bind and blind. And in this case, it is doing so. And we have to be really careful here. I don't think that King James onlyism has gotten to the point where it's like the Roman Catholic defense of the Latin Vulgate, something that people, the normal person on the street just cannot understand at all. No, that's not the case. The King James is still largely intelligible, but the Bible is so important that I'm not satisfied with largely intelligible. I want as fully intelligible as possible when it comes to my Bible translations. So that's the story. And that was one of many contributing factors in sort of radicalizing me on this issue, making me feel like, okay, someone's got to do something about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly alarming because if I remember the numbers correctly from your book, it was around 8,500 camp attendees, 100 counselors, and no one can tell you what this verse means that they're all supposed to memorize. And that to me, I mean, and you make this point too. You can go and define every single word. It's like, okay, I
Right.
know what that word means. I know what that word means, but still miss the meaning of the passage.
Right. Yeah. In any wise is just not a phrase that we use. It does show up elsewhere in the King James Version, and it's escaping me now exactly where it shows up. If I could get on Logos, I could tell you in 1 second. But in context, it just kind of means in any way, even in the other places where it occurs, I believe. Maybe there are several places. But looking up the individual words isn't actually going to help you, especially if you use a contemporary dictionary, because we don't use the word wise or the phrase in any wise the way they did back then. And what I've had common, King James only people tell me almost every day, well, let me be super honest. Okay, like every week I would say is, well, you just got to use Strong's Concordance and a Webster's 1828 dictionary. I just can't tell you how many times I've heard that, and you'll be just fine. And I think, if you will do those things and if you have some understanding of what they're trying to do, yes, that will help. And I don't want to deny that. But it isn't enough, I've discovered, because Webster himself, just a few years after he put out his 1828 dictionary in 1833, he put out a revision of the King James Bible. And all he was revising, as I understand it, having read the preface carefully, was the English. He said literally all of the same things that I say about half of the King James's lifetime ago. He was saying there are dead words in the King James. He didn't use that exact phrase, but words that, we don't use anymore. And then he said there are words that present false ideas. I call them false friends. Words that you don't know, that you read right past assuming you understand. I just had a King James onlyist tell me yesterday well, of course, when you don't understand. And the fact is, I didn't. And I'm confident because of these false friends, a lot of people don't. It's the greatest irony to me that my King James only brothers are constantly quoting to me, well, you just got to study to show thyself approved. You've got to look these words up if you don't know them. And fine, great. I look up words all the time. But study in that passage in the King James, 2 Timothy 2:15, did not mean hit the books. It meant be diligent. English changes over time, and the changes are often subtle enough and sort of slow enough that they only take one step away. The senses only take one step away from what they used to be, and so the new sense still kind of works in context, as it does with study, and so you think you understand, but you don't. And this is my major contribution, really, to the debate, showing that it's not as simple as saying, well, you just got to use a dictionary. I've asked repeatedly till I just don't know what else to say to people. How are you supposed to look up words you don't realize you're misunderstanding?
Yeah, exactly. And to me, and we're gonna dive into that concept of false friends and dead words, which I'm super excited about because that was a very eye-opening part of the scripture for me. But it seems so odd to me that the King James advocates so quickly dismiss the King James preface, which you reference, and I've actually had Joshua Barzon on, which is he directed me towards this book. And so the King James preface, not only do they admit that they are likely going to be met with suspicion and all that, and I encourage you guys to go check out that interview in and of itself for more details on that. But they had a heart and an urgency for those who were of lower education, of lower social class. And for some reason, the King James people, they feel the need to taunt these people and insult these people, even you, who's somebody that's extremely educated.
Yeah, I just got a note yesterday from somebody that was commenting from one of those joint accounts, like husband and wife, and I assumed it was the husband. It was actually the wife. And she was pushing back and saying that, well, I'm thankful that, I could read this, but I think I could go from memory. She said, I'm so thankful that I didn't have a public school education, because all these public school educated people are dumbed down. And, now you're trying to make the Bible dumbed down for them. And normally I restrain myself from pointing out, I'm a full-time writer and an editor, and your comment is chock full of grammatical, punctuation, and capitalization errors. But this time, she was so nasty. I didn't know it was her at the time. I just had to do what Proverbs 26 says, and that is answer a fool according to his folly. I won't say this woman is a fool. I'll say that with regard to this, she was foolish. She's proclaiming her superior knowledge of English, but in her comment demonstrating that she does not have a superior knowledge of English. I am a professional. This is my lifeblood. I have to catch errors all the time, in my own writing and in others. And it's terribly sad to me. I'm just so grieved about how many people want to, in the King James only world, want to put down any effort to make the Bible more understandable. And they do it with comments that are riddled with grammatical and other errors. And it makes me feel like, I hardly want to say, I just have to treat them with such gentleness, because it is a very delicate matter to tell people, typically, you don't understand what you think you understand. So here's the angle that I take. I could go on the attack, and a lot of these folks, in a sense, deserve it. I get a lot of nasty comments that are just sin. And the Bible authorizes me, I think, to answer fools according to their folly. But I don't do it very often. It's the exception when I let myself get snarky. I really try to rein myself
in. I do it every day.
We all have our different callings and giftings, brother. But I feel I'm called to reach people who are dear sheep of Christ, who really are saved, who are my brothers and sisters, who get so much right, who have many strengths. I really believe this. And yet they have this blind spot, or I could put it this way, they're caught in a trap. And they don't think it's a trap. They think it's a banner that they wave around. Here they are, if you can imagine the sheep waving its hoof around with this banner, which is actually a big metal trap clamped on their arm. And I'm having to come and say to them, no, let me free you from this trap. And they're angry. They're nipping at my arms as I do this. But I'm motivated because I know it's right, because the Bible tells me so, and because I get so many. I can't tell you how many nice notes I get from pastors, especially that were trained in the King James only world, who tell me I needed this so much. And some of them articulate it, some of them don't, but it's very common with them. In fact, I'm going to say it's like 95% of them. They didn't get enough Greek training, and they got zero Hebrew training to really evaluate the more difficult and complex arguments that are made back and forth between the King James only world and my world. But they know English. They speak it well. They're native speakers. And when I explain to them, how long halt you between two opinions doesn't mean what you always thought. Study to show thyself approved doesn't mean what you always thought. Remove not the ancient landmark doesn't mean what you always thought. They're grateful. So my strategy is to build on common ground with these sheep that are caught in a trap, to say, you want to understand God's word, don't you? And they're in their hearts, they say, yes, I do want to understand. And that's where we can go from. We can build a good, solid building on that common ground, and then build a bridge.
Yeah, well, and it really does ignore the fact that there are different audiences with different developmental phases of their life. I love how you referenced your son, who was 3 at the time, and how he was just not grasping the line, a gentle tongue breaks the bone. And you even reference, which I didn't even know this, and I found it really fascinating, how there's books like Hebrews and Luke that use a very complex version of Greek based off their audience. And then you have Greek used in the book of John, for example, that uses a much more simple form.
I really wish that I could read Greek like a native speaker. I'm afraid that I was trained like very many people in the US, and I believe around the Western world today. I was trained in the grammar translation method, and I don't speak Koine Greek, and I can't really listen to it very well. I have done it a little, and I was surprised how much I could get. There's a great YouTube series that actually goes through the Gospels with video and puts the Greek on the screen and reads it out loud. So I have gotten pretty far with it, but I don't have a native speaker's feel. But even with my, somewhat limited abilities with Greek, compared to a native speaker, again, I think I have pretty good ones, as far as American education is concerned. But I frequently am thinking, boy, there's this added level of the native speaker I don't have. Anyway, I can definitely perceive that Luke, Acts, actually also, and Hebrews are just more difficult. The word order just feels scrambled. But Greek can handle that because word order functions differently than it does in English, which, not so incidentally, is another point of pushback against our King James only brothers, because they commonly say to me, I mean, I hear the same objections all the time until I just don't seem to hear anything new anymore. They say, well, it's absolutely crucial that we be very, very literal in our translation so we can be accurate. So we've got to keep the word order of the Greek. And I say two things to that. One, that's not translation. Translation means getting the meaning across, not necessarily the form. You're not going to get any of the exact forms. They're all in Greek or Hebrew. And Greek and Hebrew just do not work the same way that English does. So you cannot keep the word order at all times. Secondly, the King James translators were not such dummies as to keep the word order all the time. They knew that word order is part of what needs to be translated. So we have this superstitious view among people who can't read Greek or Hebrew at all as to what translation can do. That the idea that there can be a perfect translation. Anybody who's actually worked in Bible translation or translating from any language to another knows immediately that just isn't possible. You can get a very good translation. You can get multiple accurate translations, but perfect is always going to be beyond our grasp unless, as the King James translators themselves say with utter clarity in their preface, unless an extraordinary measure of God's Spirit is given. It takes God to make a perfect translation.
Absolutely. And again, guys, go check out that video with the preface. Joshua has written an amazing book on the preface as well. So wonderful, wonderful thing to read, especially for our KJV only advocates. Just like you said, Mark, they weren't expecting to make a perfect translation, only good ones better. And there was a respect placed on the previous translations. And it's sad to see what they have done when the translators themselves don't even admit to such things. And then you have the
Right.
KJV advocates say, well, the preface wasn't inspired, but everything else was.
Yeah, the preface and the Apocrypha. As part of the 1611. I don't tend to mention the Apocrypha. It feels like a gotcha. But sometimes it's useful. But the preface, I put a lot of weight on, because when I read that preface, I get such comfort. I feel like here's people who understand me. My favorite line comes from the very beginning, where it says, the King James translators say, cavil, if it do not find a hole, will make one. And a cavil is a petty objection. And I feel like it's my calling to answer petty objections all day long in comments on my YouTube channel, and to try to do it with patience. Sometimes I don't succeed, but it just comforts me to know, okay, I'm not the first person to have to deal with this, and people can be persuaded. A lot of my friends have, from the very beginning thought, well, why bother with this? The King James only folks can't be persuaded. I have found that is not true. There are many gracious and godly people in that world who are just following along with what they've been taught, but they get out there into pastoral ministry and they're humbled by how difficult it is, and they want to know their Bibles. They are praying and actively seeking the Lord, and I come along through various means and help them see how they could understand the Bible even better, and their hearts yearn for it. Those people are out there, and they're worth spending the time to seek and to save.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I actually have an interesting question. So I'm still listening, but I'm going to step away to open the door real quick. But I am very curious in general of your thoughts on the Apocrypha, because that was part of the original King James Version and was removed in the 1800s. But also, stemming off of that, I think a lot of people just assume what they have sitting in their laps a lot of time is the 1611 KJV. But as you mentioned, there were several revisions made to even the initial KJV. So could you also speak on that? And I will be right back.
Sure, no problem. I'll punt a little bit on the Apocrypha and say just go read Michael Kruger's book, Canon Revisited, or The Canon Revisited. It's my go-to source for information on canon. And I take the classic Protestant Reformation understanding of the extent of the canon. But when it comes to, and now I'm forgetting the second part of what he asked, and now Jordan is gone. It was about the Apocrypha. And, do they have the 1611 King James? No, right. Yeah, the King James that's used commonly today is some version of the 1769 Oxford edition done by Benjamin Blaney. And I see all the time claims, I saw it today, again, that the Blaney edition of 1769 does not differ at all, except in spelling from the 1611. And that is simply verifiably not the case. David Norton has done excellent work on this, as has F.H.A. Scrivener going back into the 19th century, who did a version of the King James, basically an edited edition of the King James called the New Cambridge Paragraph Bible, or the Cambridge Paragraph Bible, I'm sorry. It was David Norton who did the New Cambridge Paragraph Bible in 2005. So you can go see in a big table all the differences between the 1611 and the 1769. And David Norton actually did textual criticism on the King James Bible and brought it back to the intent of the 1611 translators. So that's an edition I've got up on my shelf and am very glad to have. But it's his textual history of the King James Bible that is especially worth having when it comes to this. And I'm planning to do a video at some point going through some of the more significant differences between the 1611 and the 1769. Now, Jordan, I really hate to say this, but I myself can't stay beyond the hour. I could probably push it just a minute or two. I have another meeting coming up. Was there another key question to get to before we wrap up?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess just in general, what was the difference between the
1611 and the 1769?
Not that, the dead words and the false friends.
Yeah. Why don't I just send people to the playlist on my YouTube channel? Maybe after you publish this, you could put the playlist link there and I can send it to you. It's my 50 False Friends in the King James YouTube series. And actually, I'm up to 62 or so, and I've got more coming. These are words that you think you know, but I bet you don't. And I will be shocked if anybody could watch that whole series and say, oh, yeah, I knew every single one of these. I really doubt that you did, because I myself knew very few of them. I learned a lot making this series, and I have a lot of these sent to me now by people who were basically trained by my methods. So I would encourage people to go and look at that series, 50 False Friends in the King James.
Absolutely. And guys, again, that book is in the description. It has so much other great resources in it. Thank you so much, Mark, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jordan. God bless you.
You too. And guys, be sure to give this a like, and we will be back next time with another great conversation. Thank you so much to my generous patrons who help me do this full time. If you'd like to help me do this full time, there is a PayPal donation link in the description, or consider becoming a Patreon today. For only $5 a month, you can gain access to weekly Patreon only streams and posts, all my research notes, and all your comments will be prioritized and answered first. Higher tiers receive free Revivalist for Christ merch, a shout out in all videos, early access to content, and even can decide what content I post on the channel. There is much more, so consider becoming a Patreon today by heading over to patreon.com/revivalistforchrist. If you're not sure that you're going to heaven, be sure to click the video on the left or click on the right for more great content. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel to help equip you, the 21st century Christian, in the field of apologetics and evangelism by clicking on the channel logo in the middle.